going to summer school. Summer school. Ooh, where the kids are cool.
Topic 1. There's a new Star Trek film out. It's been
Really?
a huge, yeah. It's been a huge success. Reviews have been good. They're already planning a sequel. So what do you think? Did they successfully reinvent the franchise, or is this a travesty? Rob.
Well, I think if the goal was to reboot the franchise and make it fresh for a new generation of people that had never seen it before, they succeeded admirably. The great cast, great direction. I just have story notes. I have some notes. But I think as a reboot, if it gets people to go back and watch the original series, especially the children can now rediscover the remastered original series, it's more palatable to modern audiences. I think it's done its job.
Okay.
And it is, after all, the most successful Star Trek movie ever made now.
Is it really? Oh my
Worldwide.
gosh.
No, technically, well,
No, it
adjusted for inflation, the motion picture still grossed more.
I thought that last week that was passed.
No, I have the figures.
Oh my goodness.
Adjusted for inflation, Star Trek the Motion Picture made $271 million domestic.
Well, then let me tell you something.
But it's close.
I'm going to go on record right
And
now.
international, it might, I don't know what the international figures are.
I'm going to go on record and say, I don't care what anyone says, Star Trek the Motion Picture is my favorite Star Trek movie.
Wow, dude.
Whoa.
Strong words, it's probably my second favorite.
I find it to be the longest of all the Star Trek films.
Empirically
Even
the
if it
longest.
isn't,
Really? What about
it
5?
seems that way. 5 was not good, but it was short. It seemed over pretty quick. But anyways, back to the Star Trek film. Anyone, so a qualified, successful reboot. Anybody gonna take a stand?
Well, he's totally reining it in. I mean, there's
I know, I read his
there's,
tweets.
Yes, stronger feelings in the room that are being revealed right now. I actually didn't dislike the movie, but I did feel like all of the complaints that the small group of us who feel like Star Trek, the new Star Trek, kind of betrayed some of the sensibilities that were good about the original Star Trek. You know, I feel like the movie made it so that it's palatable and so that it's an action film and that it's, you know, a re-envisioning of things that's in a familiar, like, cinematic lexicon for everybody who's watching movies today, but it wasn't actually trying to accomplish anything other than saying, it's like watching a pilot episode of a series where they're like, we're just going to show you, here's this guy and he does this, and here's this guy, he likes girls, and here's this guy, he has a syringe, and you know, there's just different people who have, you know, one thing that
Don't
they
forget
offer.
the guy who's a big douchebag.
Right, exactly,
Yeah.
big douchebag, there's always one. But so like I think in a way they might have done themselves a service by just doing that, by just doing the character study, because the biggest problem in the whole movie is the plot. The biggest problem in the movie is the climax, everything that they're battling against internally is more important than what's actually happening in the struggle in the film, the action. And then that would not place you in that position of saying that let's find a happenstance way for Mr. Spock to be on this planet, and let's find a happenstance way for Kirk to find his way on there, and you wouldn't have to answer those questions.
Well, I wonder, if I can interrupt, how much the writer's strike affected it, because it was one of those movies they had to take the script that they had and put it into production, and But you know, but they also delayed the release of the movie for so long. You'd think that if J.J. Abrams was really like, wow, I'm ashamed of this and I don't want the world to see it, do you really think that, you know, the writer's strike would have solidified it in a way that they wouldn't have changed? I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen any of it.
I saw a Q&A with the screenwriters that you can actually download on the Creative Screenwriting podcast, free podcast from iTunes, to plug another internet phenomenon. But
after you watch us.
After you finish watching Nerd Talk. They talked about the script that was shot was the script that they delivered prior to the strike, and the only work they did after the strike was, I think they did some work on that voiceover that Spock's Prime has in the cave.
Okay.
To sort of tie the plot strands together, you know, to sort of explain the backstory.
And they have announced on the DVD, there's a lot of deleted scenes. Just reading the content of those deleted scenes, I wonder why they were cut out of the film. I mean, obviously for time. But for instance, one of my biggest problems with that movie is your villains that are introduced in the opening sequence. Their ship is disabled, and then they show up 25 years later. Where have they been? Well, they've shot a huge sequence where they were apprehended by Klingons and imprisoned for 25 years. And that was shot. And why J.J. Abrams said that people didn't understand that they were Romulans, but there were these other antagonists, these Klingons. Who's the bad guys? There's two different bad guys, and one's escaping from the other, and what does that all mean? So they cut it out. I thought that was a really unfortunate excision from the film. I mean, I think that...
I gotta say, you guys are being really, really nice to Star Trek, because this was a travesty. It was made by Star Wars fans for Star Wars fans. This was not a Star Trek film. And it actually, for me, it takes a while to get into a Star Trek TV series, and I always love it by the third season or something. But for this, it was you know, the beginning, and I don't love it, and it's gonna take me a bunch of movies just to really get into it.
Well, you'll probably get those, so.
Yeah,
that's the
probably.
upside.
I don't know if I'm gonna keep going.
Well, no, I think
I'll just watch it on TV.
I definitely agree. It's absolutely, almost scene for scene, you can see the influence of Star Wars in Star Trek. And, you know, I really, not to try and alienate myself from any future involvement with him in my career, but J.J. Abrams, over the course of the past 2 years, every single time I've ever heard him speak about this movie, he always started by saying, I've always been more of a Star Wars fan. I'm not a Star Trek fan. And I remember kind of thinking,
you can't tell.
Yeah. But and I felt like I don't understand what the stigma is, because I mean, frankly, to most of the world, nerd is nerd. You know, like I mean, I think that there's
Gene Roddenberry always had the vision of, you know, well, he mentioned at one point that, you know, he didn't want to CGI or cover the face too much. He wanted you to see the actors and their eyes, and so Star Trek for me has always been more organic. And then you go to Star Wars. I did say Star Trek before, right?
Yeah.
When you go to Star Wars, it's like CGI and blobs and shit.
Well, and the other big difference, which you can really see in this film, is that Star Wars is very much a sort of youthful fantasy, in the same way that Harry Potter is. It's everybody's dream that, you know, I don't like my parents and I don't like my circumstances. What if I were destined to be a prince? And what if the fate of an entire civilization was resting on me? Like that's a very, you know, archetypal fantasy that exists in many mythologies.
Yeah, Captain Kirk is the one in this movie.
But exactly, and not only that, he stumbles into all of his successes in the same way that Luke Skywalker does. I mean, there's both Luke and Han in him. You know, it's like you're watching this film where the familiar Captain Kirk that we've seen through the episodes and films that exist, you know, supposedly after this story's being told, he's the most effete at everything. He's the person who is good at fighting, he's good at strategy, he's smart, he's witty, he's whatever. And our expectation is to see him prevail. Whereas in this movie, the entire bridge crew of the Starship Enterprise, you show them sort of reluctantly and ineffectually stumbling into their roles. It's like the least qualified, least experienced bridge crew that's ever met space. And we're meant to believe like this is the beginning of a magical voyage that we're all looking forward to see. And that to me was kind of a betrayal of like you're so confident in that cast from the previous shows that all you want to see is how are they going to handle these circumstances, because I know they're the men to do it. This movie spent a great deal of time convincing you not only are they not the men to do it, they don't want to be the men to do it, they don't deserve to be the men to do it, and oh, and here's a girl in a short dress. You know, it's like I felt like there was really, they had, and I think, Rob, this is actually a point that you made at one point, that that they really did a good job trying to fill the requirement of what they thought the audience wanted, but because of not having that intimate understanding of Star Trek, it was all a series of like cliches, like have the red shirt guy get killed or whatever, like to say that people who have a pop culture understanding of Star Trek that may have come from Saturday Night Live or from stand-up comedy will go, oh, these are the few facts I know about Star Trek, and I want to see all of those.
Which is actually funny because the trailer, like the first teaser that came out for the Star Trek movie, was pretty much targeted to Star Trek fans. I mean, you know, you've got that they're working on the Enterprise, you know.
Oh, yeah.
That's
on
great.
the ground,
so you're like,
though.
woo, yeah, Trekkies, you know. And then suddenly it's like, whoop, oh, Star Wars fans. It's made for Star Wars fans.
Well, this raises a good point. The big continuity reboot that now, you know, there's this alternate timeline where none of the Star Trek stuff that we know happened. How upset should we be that these fictional stories are now more fictional?
Well, I think that one of the they obviously did not want to be hampered by 43 years of established continuity, and I can understand that. But on the other hand, they went back and they told the story about when Kirk and Spock first met. You could have told that story within established continuity. And I think one of the things that has always been interesting about all the Star Trek shows is how the writers and producers have used that continuity and built upon it. Sometimes they haven't always done a great job, but it's nice to be able to reference things like, oh, they're talking about the character's history from that show or that show. I was listening to on my iPod, I was listening to the classic Star Trek episode Obsession. And in that episode, Kirk encounters a vampire cloud that he encountered when he was an ensign on the Farragut. And the creature, when he was an ensign, killed half the crew, including the captain. And it happened 11 years prior to this particular episode. And you're thinking, okay, Kirk was an ensign on a starship that had half of its crew decimated. And that gave him this backstory that you could then take into every subsequent Star Trek episode. And you have this sort of interesting tapestry that's being woven, and now that tapestry is gone.
In a way, they also cheat themselves, I think, because when you're working with an established franchise, part of the shoe-in for the devoted faithful of that franchise is you can satisfy them by putting these little nuggets of, you'll get this, putting something in there that says this is just for hardcore fans, and you're going to understand this reference, and people who don't understand it won't care. But they don't. I mean,
Archer's dog.
But see, I think that there's definitely that they're now, unless they're planning to somehow cherry pick those references and then back into justifying them, which is a much more arduous thing than just saying we have this huge amount of text that we can work with, and story and character development. Why go back and try and wipe the slate clean and give us a reason to believe that none of that should exist? Or to constantly fill fans with the frustration of watching those characters develop on an arc that somehow doesn't resonate with the version of them that we've come to know and love.
And Robert, you have to think about those douchebag kids that get everything handed to them. I mean, they need a role model.
Oh well, yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Captain Kirk.
It's funny that you say that. I mean, I've always maintained that the world is a much worse place now because we live in a land where every kid gets a trophy now. If you're on a sports team at the end of the season, everybody gets a trophy. Well, that doesn't help anyone. And at the end of this...
No, it helps trophy manufacturers.
Oh, yes, it does. Yes, it does. And at the end of this movie, your character, yes, he saved Earth, in fact. But what if he has to go on a first contact mission? What if he has to talk a malevolent computer to death? Does he have that skill set? He hasn't learned everything he needs to know to be a starship captain, yet they hand him the captaincy of the Federation flagship at the end of the movie after just getting off academic probation.
And that really felt to me like the throne room scene. It was like, let's put a medal around their neck and say you guys did a good job. But I think if you actually look at what was really good about Star Wars, it came after George Lucas recognized that he was going to have the opportunity to make another movie. So at the end of The Empire Strikes Back, you have this incredible cliffhanger, you have this incredible sense of, I can't wait to see what happens next. Strategically, I'm not certain.
Followed by more Muppets.
Right, well, but
Luke Skywalker earned his status in Star Wars. He
Yes.
went through that mythic journey where he was an orphan, essentially, being raised by another family. He lost that surrogate family. They were killed. He had his new mentor, Obi-Wan Kenobi, who was also taken from him and killed. And
Right, totally. And I'm not suggesting that Luke didn't deserve his accolades at the end of Star Wars. I'm merely saying that I think that at the end of Star Trek, it's like we were trying to create that same feeling of now the circle is complete, as opposed to saying, hey, how about if we go away for however long it's going to take between now and the next film, and during that film's during the passage of time, which we can decide how much it's going to be, we will assume that Kirk now gains some experience, eventually finds himself in the captain's seat. That's what happened in all of the Star Trek features that came after the series, that they had to address the fact that so much time had passed. And in a way, that was like a really great story gift, because in between the action, you're hearing the various characters addressing what's been going on in their lives, and we don't have to see it. We don't have to walk with them every day of that. We can just benefit from whatever they've learned, and that gives us the opportunity to see those characters evolve.
And also, I think that the problem, Star Trek always worked best as allegory, and somehow it referred back to our culture today. I mean, in the '60s, the only way you could address certain issues because of television standards and practices were within the context of a fantasy television show. So they could, like in an episode like A Private Little War, when the hill people are being armed by or the village people are being armed by the Klingons, and the hill people, Kirk finds his friend Tyree. It was a whole Vietnam War allegory, and the only way they could tell that story was in the context of Star Trek. The new Star Trek movie wasn't really about anything.
It was an allegory for Star Wars.
Yes, it was. Yes,
well,
it was.
I think you can make a strong argument that Star Trek exists best as a television series, as these individual 45-minute long stories where we can focus on one character or another character and watch them develop and watch them, you know, overcome some obstacle that's not some Earth, you know, threatening, you know, cube or something like that, you know.
And my favorite version of that, Deep Space Nine, was the one where, that was the one series where you really saw them take that space opera, you know, approach more so than the others. They weren't a bunch of self-contained episodes, in the same way that when we were talking about X-Files earlier, that the most satisfying episodes are the ones that have a through line where you're like, I've invested in these characters and I want to know what's happening, and we don't have to make every single episode one where people could watch it and walk away and never watch one again and have learned exactly as much as those of us who know the characters. So I agree. And if anything, like that's I think the hope of most Star Trek fans is the enthusiasm that this film's success will make it possible for there to be more series, more ways for Star Trek to be available to us in the media.
Yeah, well, I think it was just this week, Bryan Fuller says he hopes that this will bring back a series that he would be happy to run. Would we be looking forward to a Bryan Fuller Trek series?
You know, I think Bryan Fuller, I mean, he did write on Voyager. He has experience, and he's a good guy, a good writer, and he definitely is plugged into how to create great, quirky characters.
I'd prefer to bring Ron Moore back, but that's...
But yeah, I mean, look, I think that what Star Trek, a new Star Trek show, needs entirely new blood. I would like to see people come in, and it needs to adopt modern... Star Trek was mired in its 5-act structure. It was essentially the same as it was in the 60s, even through Enterprise. They would do self-contained arcs in Enterprise, but they need to adopt... I'd like to see a West Wing version of a Star Trek show. Like, I would love to have seen Enterprise be the West Wing version, and the whole thing would be about the birth of the Federation. That would have been a compelling program that, you know, one season could have been about the entire Romulan War, rather than that stupid Cindy arc.
I was waiting. The year after or something would have been the Romulan War.
Yeah, and that would have been, you know, you'd be
They
doing
even
coalition
one
building,
episode,
world building, and they just. But
I
again,
was waiting. I was sticking with it, and then no Romulan War.
Well,
Canceled.
what are our hopes for the future of Star Trek?
I do hope that, I mean, I've always wished, ever since Deep Space Nine went off the air, I would have loved to have seen that storyline continue either into features or something else. That's why I actually started reading Star Trek novels, because I wanted to, it's a big admission for me.
But like that's come back, maybe today, maybe
and that world was so welcoming to me. I just wanted to, you know, to see more of what happened to those characters, even if, and I think that there's a lot of people who feel this way about Star Trek. I've, for many years, said if there was a network that played nothing but Star Trek, I would watch that. And it wouldn't matter how many times I'd seen the episodes. There's a certain like desire to be in that universe that's fun, and I think that people feel this way about Lord of the Rings, people feel this way about Harry Potter, where when it's become really precious to you, it really isn't about, is this my favorite story, is this a good episode, is this a good movie? It's, you know, it's the music, it's the production design, it's the belief in the idea that this world exists is what's so appealing to me. So as long as it perpetuates in some fashion that doesn't completely betray everything that it once was, great. I mean, I was entertained by the movie. I just felt like there were moments in it where I thought, that's stupid, or you know, like, and that happens in every movie, and that certainly happens in other Star Trek movies. So
it was like the Jackass of Star Trek movies.
Well,
Please to explain.
Oh, it was just made for the Jackass generation of viewers.
I guess I felt like I saw so much referential material in there, so much that felt familiar, And this happens in the Bond franchise. This happens in so many franchises that have tried to persist over generations. But you know, I remember coming out of the theater thinking like, yeah, and that big fight scene that happens on the drill like reminds me of The Princess Bride, like where they're trying to, you know, how to avoid the flame spurts, and then that awful creature on Delta Vega looks like the ROUSs. I was just like, there's a lot of things that seem so familiar. And Star Trek before that had always been things that you'd never seen before. And I think like some of the really beautiful kind of civilization envisionments, the matte paintings that you would see of Bajor or Cardassia or whatever that are really beautiful, it's inspiring that that stuff can still happen, if it can still happen. I just hope that the future of Star Trek isn't this sort of very cosmopolitan kind of future that, I mean, I really felt like the first time I saw a photograph of the set of the new Enterprise, it reminded me of the Sci-Fi Channel booth at Comic-Con. I mean, just the way that it was lit and everything, and it was very much the Apple Store. You know, it was very like this very white kind of bridge with mysterious stations, and it just like everything about it felt
very
less
IKEA look.
Yeah, less functional, less and when you actually, if you know anything about you know, nautical travel, like that real estate is always at a premium on any kind of a ship, and like on a submarine particularly, but on these big battleships and on aircraft carriers, they have a lot of space, but they still use the space very wisely. It's not, you know, it's not a place where you're going to see expansive quarters or I mean, you just don't have that.